I woke up, and for a few seconds, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. My phone was lit up, glowing in the dark like a warning flare. Notifications stacked on top of each other, calls, messages, news alerts, all repeating the same thing in different words. And in that moment, lying there in the quiet of early morning, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Fear, real fear. The kind that settles in your chest before your mind even knows what's wrong. I remember sitting up slowly, like my body was suddenly heavier than it had ever been. My heart was racing, but the room was completely still, and there was this strange, almost painful awareness that something inside my world had shifted while I was sleeping. And as I picked up the phone, as I scrolled through the messages, as I read the headlines, I realized the unthinkable. My company, the company I had poured my life into, was gone. Not gone in the way people imagine, not bankrupt, not vanished into thin air, but gone in a way that felt almost worse, because it was no longer mine. And for the first time in decades, I understood what it meant to build something so big that one day it might grow beyond your control. If you're over 50, maybe you know this feeling. That slow, heavy realization that your life's work can outgrow you and then leave you behind. I remember sinking back into the mattress, staring at the ceiling, unable to breathe for a moment. It felt surreal, impossible, like someone had erased my name from my own story. And the strange thing is, it didn't happen overnight. It just felt like it did. The signs were always there. Tiny cracks in the structure I had built, decisions made by people I had once mentored, directions taken without my voice in the room, slow shifts in culture, priorities, values. But that morning, all those small cracks merged into one single truth. Amazon no longer needed me, and it no longer belonged to me. And I wish I could tell you I felt proud in that moment. I wish I could say I smiled and thought, this is what I wanted, a company that could stand on its own. But that's not what I felt. I felt loss, a kind of loss I wasn't prepared for. People warn you about retirement. People warn you about aging. But nobody warns you about what it feels like when the thing that defined you, your purpose, your identity, your North Star, continues on without you. And I realized something that morning that shook me more than losing control of a trillion-dollar company. I had tied my entire sense of self to something that was never meant to stay mine forever. I got out of bed and walked to the window. It was early, too early. The world was still quiet, the kind of quiet you only hear when you're older, when you wake up before the sun, because sleep doesn't come as easily anymore. I watched the sky slowly shift from black to gray, and I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the inside of me and left only the shell. And I kept thinking to myself, how did I get here? How did I let something I built swallow me whole? How did I spend decades climbing a mountain only to realize the peak wasn't what I thought it was? And if you're listening to me right now, especially if you're over 60, I want you to hear this carefully. One day, you're going to wake up and something in your life, your job, your company, your family, your role will no longer need you. And when that moment comes, you must be ready for it. I wasn't. That morning, I made coffee, but I couldn't taste it. My hands felt clumsy, my breathing uneven. And I kept replaying the same question in my mind. If I'm not the head of Amazon, then who am I? It's a question I had avoided for years. I drowned it with work, with meetings, deadlines, growth, expansion, with noise. But silence has a way of forcing truth into the room. And that morning, the silence was deafening. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't know my place in the world. Not as an entrepreneur, not as a leader, not as the man the media turns into a caricature, not as the face of a global empire, just a man in his late 50 seconds, standing in a quiet kitchen, realizing he had allowed one part of his life to become all of his life. And that's when the fear deepened. Because losing control of Amazon wasn't really the fear. The real fear was discovering that Jeff Bezos, the man behind the company, had become smaller than the company itself. And I want to tell you the truth. The truth I didn't admit for decades. I didn't build Amazon alone. I didn't carry it alone. I didn't shape it alone. But I did let it consume me alone. And when you let something consume you, even if it's something great, you give it the power to leave you empty when it's gone. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in my hands, and I realized something that I had been avoiding for years. I had built a company that could survive anything, but I hadn't built a life that could survive letting go of that company. And that is a very different thing. When you're young, you think building is everything. You think growth is everything. You think ambition is the fuel that keeps you alive. But when you get older, when your bones start to ache a little, when your mornings get quieter, when your mind feels heavier, you start to understand that building is easy. Letting go is the hard part. People think success gets easier with age. It doesn't. It gets more complicated, more fragile, because every achievement comes with a shadow, a cost, a part of you that slowly gets traded away. And that morning, looking at my phone, looking at the headlines saying the board was moving on without me, that the future was shifting, that new leadership was taking over. I felt all those traded pieces landing on me at once. It wasn't just news. It was a mirror I had avoided for years. And in that mirror, I didn't see the man in the documentaries. I didn't see the billionaire people argued about online. I didn't see the entrepreneur people either praised or criticized. I saw a tired man, a man who had run so hard for so long he forgot why he started running. I remember touching my face, noticing how different it felt now. Older, more worn, more real. And I whispered to myself, almost under my breath, what did I do to myself? It's not a question you can answer easily. It sits there, heavy, almost painful. When I built Amazon, I was hungry, driven, desperate to prove something to myself. But when you're older, there comes a moment when you realize the thing you were chasing wasn't the thing you needed. And that morning, I realized I had spent 30 years chasing a version of myself that no longer existed. The world still saw that version. The media still described him. People still believed in that story. But the truth was simpler and sadder. I was aging. I was slowing down. And the machine I built moved faster without me. It's a strange feeling to watch the world keep going at full speed while you quietly step off the track. It makes you confront your own humanity in a way no success or headline ever prepared you for. I walked through the house in silence. The walls felt different. The rooms felt unfamiliar, even though I had lived in them for years. And that's when it hit me a feeling I didn't expect. Shame. Not shame about losing control, not shame about stepping down, but shame about how much of my identity I had tied to one single thing. You see, as a young man, I thought I knew who I was, a builder, a thinker, an outsider, a dreamer. But over time, I stopped being that person. I started being Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, a title, a role, a character. And when the role gets taken away, when the character is no longer needed, you're forced to meet yourself again, often for the first time in decades. That morning, I felt like I was meeting a stranger with my name, my memories, my regrets, but not my purpose. I sat down on the couch, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the weight of everything, the stress, the expectations, the pressure to always be bigger, better, faster. And I realized something painful. I had built the future, but I never built a present for myself. Everything was later. Later I'll rest. Later I'll reflect. Later I'll reconnect with the people who matter. Later I'll take care of my health. Later I'll breathe again. But later never comes. If you're over 50, you know this truth better than anyone. Life speeds up, not down. Your responsibilities grow larger, not smaller. And suddenly, one day, you look around and realize you've been living inside a storm you created, a storm that doesn't stop just because you're tired. And in that stillness, in that quiet morning light, I finally understood something that took me decades to see clearly. I didn't lose my company that day. I lost myself long before it happened. And the moment I realized that The moment that truth settled into me, I knew my life was about to change, not because the company was gone, but because I could finally see the part of me I had been ignoring, the part that had been waiting for years for me to wake up. I walked outside that morning, still holding the phone in my hand, not even realizing I hadn't put on shoes. The ground was cold. The air was quiet in a way that almost made me uncomfortable. And as I stood there, staring at nothing, I felt a kind of loneliness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It's strange how silence feels different when you're older. When you're young, silence feels like peace. When you're older, silence feels like truth. And the truth that morning was sharp. I had built a life filled with meetings, decisions, numbers, deadlines, a life where there was always someone waiting for me, always something demanding my attention. There was no room for silence, no room for fear, no room for honesty. And now, suddenly, there was nothing. Just a man in his 50s standing barefoot on cold stone, realizing he had been living as a symbol instead of a human being. I remember looking up at the sky and thinking, I'm free, but I don't know how to live as a free man. Most people dream of retirement. Most people dream of stepping away from responsibility. But when you've spent decades carrying the weight of a global machine, letting go doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like losing oxygen. I went back inside and sat in one of the chairs I rarely used. You know how it is when you work too much. Your house becomes more of a decoration than a place of living. I had walked past that chair 1,000 times, but I don't think I ever actually sat in it before. And that bothered me because that chair represented something I didn't want to face. There were parts of my own life that I never lived, parts that waited for me, parts that I ignored, parts that silently collected dust while I chased the next deadline, the next expansion, the next milestone. And now, without Amazon in the center of my life, I had to confront those forgotten parts. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I had a day with nothing scheduled. I couldn't remember, not one day. Not one morning where I woke up without someone expecting something from me. And in that moment, I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, softly, like a thin thread snapping after being pulled tight for too many years. You see, losing control of Amazon wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing how much of my own life I had handed away piece by piece without noticing it. People think success is one big sacrifice, but it's not. It's thousands of tiny sacrifices you don't notice until they've already taken something from you. You sacrifice sleep, then your hobbies, then your friendships, then your health, then your marriage, then your sense of self. And by the time you realize it, you've given away more than you ever planned to. I had given away decades I will never get back. Decades that feel shorter now because time moves differently when you're older. It doesn't expand the way it used to. It contracts, it shrinks, it speeds up, and in that shrinking space, you begin to see the truth. You don't own your successes. Your successes own you. I leaned back in that chair, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think about my childhood. I thought about my mother. I thought about the man who raised me. I thought about the uncertainty, the instability, the desire to escape the modest life we had. Back then, I promised myself I would build something big, something powerful, something unshakable, and I did. But as I sat there, older, worn, tired, I realized I had built something so big that I no longer recognized the boy who started it all. That boy had dreams, simple dreams, human dreams. And somewhere along the way, those dreams were replaced with obligations. People think becoming wealthy or successful makes you more free. But the truth is, it often binds you tighter than anything else. Because when millions of people rely on you, you lose the luxury of being human. You become a function, a role, a symbol. And the man underneath all of that slowly fades. That morning, I realized I wanted him back. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the headline, but the man, the son, the friend, the father, the human being who once believed life was bigger than a job, bigger than a company, bigger than the image the world projected onto him. And here's the painful truth. I didn't know how to find him again. I had spent so many years being one version of myself that all the other versions felt distant, blurred, forgotten. It was like waking up in your own house and realizing you no longer know the layout of the rooms. That's what losing Amazon felt like. Not losing a company, not losing power, but losing the identity that had swallowed everything else. And if you're listening to me right now, especially if you're in your 50 seconds, 60 seconds, or older, please hear this carefully. One day you will lose something you built your entire life around. A job, a title, a role in your family, a responsibility, a part of your identity. And when that day comes, the only thing that will save you is whether you built a life outside of that identity. I didn't. Not then, not yet. But that morning, looking at those headlines, feeling the weight of years pressing into my chest, I knew I had to start. And that single realization, as painful as it was, became the moment my life began to change. I stayed in that chair for a long time, longer than I expected. And it's strange how when you finally stop moving, all the motion from the last 30 years catches up with you at once. It's like your body remembers every stress, every sleepless night, every decision that pulled a little bit of life out of you, and it brings it all to the surface. And sitting there in the silence, I finally allowed myself to feel the years I had ignored. My back ached in a way I hadn't noticed before. My breathing felt shallower. My mind felt like it was carrying the weight of entire decades that I had refused to acknowledge. For so long, I believed momentum was the cure to everything. If I just kept moving, kept building, kept climbing, nothing could touch me. But age has a way of reminding you that momentum has limits. There comes a day when your mind wakes up faster than your body. There comes a day when you hear a quiet voice telling you to slow down, and you realize you've been drowning that voice for years. And that morning, as I sat in that unfamiliar chair, I realized the voice wasn't asking me to slow down. It was asking me to finally face myself. I picked up my phone again, not because I wanted to read more news, but because I wanted to see the timeline. How long had this change been in motion? How many meetings had I missed? How many decisions had been made without me even noticing? And the truth hit me harder than the headlines. This wasn't a sudden shift. It was gradual, silent, predictable, like a tide slowly rising around you, and by the time you look down, the water's already at your waist. I had stepped back little by little, first from some meetings, then from certain decisions, then from entire directions of the company. I told myself it was intentional, that I was creating space, that I was giving others a chance to lead. But the truth is, part of me was tired. Part of me was afraid of facing the possibility that the next chapter of Amazon might require someone younger, someone hungrier, someone less worn down by the weight of history. And that fear, that quiet fear I never spoke out loud, became the door that allowed the company to grow without me, not because I lost control, but because I let go without realizing I was releasing my own identity with it. I stood up from the chair and walked to the mirror. And I don't know why, but seeing my own reflection felt different. The man looking back at me wasn't the man the world talked about. He wasn't the man who built one of the largest companies in history. He wasn't the man people criticized or praised. He was older, he was sadder, he was quieter. And he looked like someone who had lived too much of his life in the future and not enough in the present. I touched the edge of the mirror and whispered something I hadn't said to myself in years. Where have you been? Not physically, emotionally, spiritually, humanly. Because somewhere between the warehouses, the logistics, the expansion, the innovation, I had lost the simple parts of myself. The part that laughed easily, the part that made time for people without scheduling it, the part that felt joy without needing it to be productive, the part that didn't measure life in metrics or milestones. I felt like I was looking at a man who had lived entirely in service of a dream and forgotten that dreams are meant to serve the person too. I sat down again, this time on the floor, because the floor felt grounding. It felt real. It felt like something solid when everything else around me felt uncertain. And that's when the memories started coming back. Not memories of success, not meetings, not deal making, not innovations, but memories of the nights I worked too late, the birthdays I missed, the moments with my children that I told myself I would make up for later, the conversations I postponed, the vacations I promised but never took, the quiet evenings I traded for conference calls. Those were the real losses. Not the company, not the control, not the headlines, but the pieces of life that were given up in silence. I put my head in my hands and felt this deep, aching regret. A regret that comes only when you are finally old enough to understand what you can never get back: time. The one currency that no success, no wealth, no achievement can ever buy. If you're listening to me right now, especially if you're in your 50 seconds or older, I want you to hear this with your heart, not your ears. You will not realize what you've lost until you stop long enough to feel the empty spaces. And the older you get, the harder those empty spaces hit you, because life becomes clearer with age, not easier, not softer, not kinder, just clearer. And in that clarity, you begin to understand that you spent so much time building something for the future that you forgot the future eventually arrives. And when it does, you have to live in it, even if you're not ready. I stayed on that floor for a long time, letting the memories come, letting the regrets surface, letting the years I had ignored finally speak. And it was painful, but it was also the first honest moment I had given myself in a very long time. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come crashing into your life. Sometimes it simply sits beside you, quietly, waiting for you to be still enough to notice. I stayed on that floor until the light coming through the window shifted, until morning slowly became afternoon. And as I finally stood up, I felt older than I ever had before. Not physically, though. Age certainly has its way of announcing itself, but emotionally, spiritually, in a way that made me understand something I had spent years avoiding. Success takes just as much as it gives, and sometimes it takes more. I walked through the house again, slowly, deliberately this time. I touched the walls, the furniture, the pictures, things I had passed 1,000 times but never really seen. And I realized something that left me standing still in the hallway. I had lived in this home for years, but I had not lived inside my own life. Everything around me felt like evidence, a quiet record of a man who built an empire but forgot to build a day-to-day existence. It's easy to hide from yourself when the world keeps you busy. It's easy to avoid hard questions when the machine around you never stops turning. But when the machine no longer needs you, when the noise goes silent, you're left with the questions you buried, questions that only come up when you're older, questions you can't run from anymore. Who am I without my work? Who am I without the pressure? Who am I when the world moves on? Who am I when I'm no longer needed? And those questions, they echo in a way that can shake a person's soul. I walked into the kitchen and I saw an old, untouched notebook sitting on the counter. I didn't even remember leaving it there. It was dusty, slightly worn on the edges, the kind of thing you promise yourself you'll get to when there's time. I opened it. And on the first page, written in my own handwriting, were the words, "When it's all over, what will matter?" I had written that sentence years ago, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of fear, maybe as a reminder for a future version of myself. But I never answered it. The page was blank beneath the question. And seeing that blank page, staring at it in silence, felt like staring into the gap between the life I lived and the life I should have lived. It hit me harder than any headline, harder than any board meeting, harder than losing control of Amazon. Because in that moment, I wasn't looking at my company's future, I was looking at my own. When it's all over, what will matter? When you're young, you think you know the answer. You think the world is built on accomplishments, on legacy, on pushing harder, reaching higher, outlasting everyone around you. But when you reach your 50 seconds, your 60 seconds, your 70 seconds, you begin to understand the real answers. It's not the money, it's not the achievements, it's not the milestones the world praises. It's the dinners you missed, the conversations you postponed, the people you lost touch with, the health you ignored, the peace you never gave yourself, the memories you never created because you were too busy creating. Success, those things become the loudest regrets. And the older you get, the harder they are to silence. I closed the notebook and sat down, not to write, just to sit. And I thought about the boy. I used to be the boy who loved science, who loved tinkering, who dreamed big, but also valued the small human things. Where had he gone? Where had I buried him? Under which layer of responsibility? Under which year of nonstop pressure? Under which success story? I didn't know, but I knew I wanted him back. Not to erase what I built, not to undo the decades, but to rediscover the parts of myself that had been sacrificed along the way. Because that's the truth. Nobody tells you about ambition. If you're not careful, it takes pieces of you never meant to give away. And by the time you realize it, those pieces are very hard to get back. I stood up again, slowly, and looked out the window. The world was still moving, still busy, still loud. But inside me, something was changing. Something was shifting. The old rhythm was breaking. The old narrative was falling apart. I wasn't the man who woke up that morning. I was someone else, someone stripped of titles, stripped of control, stripped of assumptions. And strangely, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, a painful beginning, a slow beginning, a beginning shaped by age, by regret, by clarity, but a beginning nonetheless. And then, almost unexpectedly, I felt a strange calm settle inside me. Because as painful as this morning had been, it also forced me to confront a truth I should have faced long ago. The company moved on, but I still had time, maybe not decades, maybe not youth, but time nonetheless to rebuild myself, not as a CEO, not as a public figure, not as a billionaire, but as a man, a human being who still had choices, who still had a future, who still had the ability to shape something meaningful, not for the world, but for himself. And that realization, gentle, quiet, honest, was the first real breath I had taken in years. I stayed by that window for a long time, not thinking about Amazon, not thinking about money, not thinking about legacy, just standing there, older, quieter, more human than I had allowed myself to be in decades. And something inside me finally softened. For most of my life, I lived with this constant tension, a tightness in the chest, a pressure behind the eyes, a readiness to respond, to fix, to act. But as I stood there in the silence of my own home, I felt something I had almost forgotten: stillness. Not the stillness of exhaustion, not the stillness that comes after you've pushed your body too far, but the stillness of being present in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe not since I was young. And that presence allowed one thought to rise into clarity. I survived the loss of my company, but have I survived the loss of myself? That question settled into me, heavy, honest, impossible to ignore. And that's when I began to understand the real lesson of that morning. It wasn't about stepping down. It wasn't about leadership transitioning. It wasn't about the company moving forward. It was about something deeper, something every person over 50 eventually has to face. You cannot outrun yourself forever, not with success, not with ambition, not with routine, not with distraction, and certainly not with work. Eventually, the person you ignored demands to be seen. I walked away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, not out of exhaustion, but out of realization, because it hit me gently, quietly, that for the first time in decades, I had nothing left to chase. And that's a moment most people don't prepare for, especially people my age, especially people who have spent their whole lives pushing forward, upward, relentlessly. Nobody teaches you what to do when the mountain you've climbed is behind you. Nobody teaches you how to live when achievement is no longer your identity. And so many people, good people, men and women who spent their lives working, providing, surviving, they reach their 60 seconds and suddenly feel lost. Not because life is over, but because the life they knew no longer exists. I felt that loss that morning, not loudly, but deeply. Like a light fading leaving behind a room you've known your whole life, but never truly seen until the darkness settled. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling my breath steady, feeling my heartbeat slow, and memories began to surface. Not the ones tied to success, not the ones tied to strategy or growth, but the human ones. The laughter from old dinners, the warmth of simpler years, the rare vacations where time seemed to stretch a little, the quiet moments with the people I loved, moments that were few and too far apart. Those were the moments I remembered. Not the headlines, not the milestones, not the achievements. And that realization hurt more than losing control of Amazon ever could. Because as you get older, your perspective shifts in ways you never expect. You don't measure your life by how big it became. You measure it by how deeply you lived it. And for the first time, I had to admit to myself, I built a big life. I didn't build a deep one. I sat up slowly, feeling a kind of honesty settle into me that I hadn't allowed in years. I whispered into the empty room, I miss too much, and I can't get it back. It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't regret in the dramatic sense. It was truth. And truth, at my age, is not a sharp pain. It is a slow ache, the kind that moves through you gently, but leaves nothing untouched. I thought about the pressure I put on myself for decades, the pressure to succeed, the pressure to never slow down, the pressure to always be more, do more, be everywhere at once. And I finally realized what that pressure had cost me. Presence. Not success, not opportunity, not growth. Presence. The ability to fully experience life, not as a leader, not as a builder, but as a person. And the older you get, the more you understand that presence is the real wealth of life. Everything else fades. I stood up again, but this time, I didn't feel the heaviness. I didn't feel the fear. I didn't feel the loss. I felt something else. A quiet determination, a calm sense of direction, a simple, gentle purpose. Because losing my company made me realize something important, something that only becomes clear with age. There is a life after success, but you have to choose it. You have to build it. And you have to allow yourself to live it. Not the life the world expects of you, not the life your younger self imagined, not the life shaped by momentum and pressure, but the life that waits for you in the quiet moments you once ignored. A life that begins not with ambition, but with acceptance. And it was in that acceptance that the next chapter of my life finally began. That evening, after the shock had settled, after the silence had done its work, after the truth had finally stopped resisting, I walked outside again. The sun was setting. A slow, gentle kind of sunset, the kind that reminds you how quickly light disappears when you aren't paying attention. And I stood there, older, tired, but somehow more alive than I had felt in years. Because that morning had taken something from me, yes, but it had also revealed something I didn't know I still had. Time, not endless time, not youthful time, not the kind of time you waste because you believe there will always be more, but real time, honest time, the time of a man in his later years who understands the value of a single day, the weight of a single decision, the meaning of a single moment, the kind of time that finally matters. I remember sitting down on the edge of a stone step and watching the last light fade across the horizon. And in that quiet, that deep, reflective quiet, I finally felt gratitude. Not gratitude for success, not gratitude for wealth or recognition, but gratitude for the chance at this age to start again. Gratitude for the clarity that comes only after you've lost something you leaned on for too long. Gratitude for the chance to rebuild not a company, but a life. Because that's the truth most people don't understand until they reach this age. A second life begins when the first one stops making sense. And that morning, mine stopped making sense. But that evening, I began to see the outlines of a new one. Not built on ambition, not built on pressure, not built on running faster than time, but built on the things I once overlooked: peace, presence, health, slowness, family, love, humanity, everything I had once pushed aside because I believed there would always be time later. Later is a lie. Later is a thief. And later becomes never when you're not paying attention. As the sky darkened, I thought about my future, not the future of a company, not the future of an empire, my future, the man I would be when I no longer had anything to build except myself. And it humbled me because I realized with a strange mixture of sadness and relief that the most important work of my life had nothing to do with Amazon. It had to do with healing, facing myself, repairing what success had quietly broken, reclaiming the small, simple human moments that ambition had pushed to the edges. I whispered into the dusk, I'm still here. Not the CEO, not the builder, not the name in the headlines, me, just me. And that felt like enough. Maybe for the first time ever, I went back inside. The house looked different, not because anything had changed, but because I walked to that old chair again, sat in it, put my hands on my knees, and took a long, deep breath that felt like it came from somewhere I hadn't reached in years. And in that stillness, I understood the final truth of that morning. I didn't wake up and realize my company was gone. I woke up and realized I had a life waiting for me that I had never truly lived. And losing what I thought defined me was the only way to finally see it, the only way to return to myself. So if you're listening to me right now, especially if you're in your 50 seconds, 60 seconds, or 70 seconds, please hear this. You will lose things: roles, titles, positions, identities, certainties. Life will take them from you, sometimes all at once, sometimes quietly, slowly, over years. But what life gives you in return, the chance to be human again, is something far more valuable than anything you will ever build. You are more than your work. You are more than your responsibilities. You are more than the world's expectations. And no matter how old you are, no matter how much time has passed, you can always begin again. Not out there, not in some future dream, but here, inside yourself, where your real life has been waiting for decades. I leaned back in that chair and closed my eyes, not in sadness, not in fear, but in acceptance. And in that acceptance, I discovered something I had forgotten. I am allowed to live, not just build, not just push, not just carry the world, but live honestly, gently, fully. And as the last light of that day faded, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not because I still owned my company, but because for the first time, I owned myself.